Under Spanish rule, it remained a sparsely populated territory. Its northern border, poorly defined and even more poorly defended, became a porous boundary between two worlds. To the north lay the burgeoning United States, eager to expand its territory and influence. To the south, Florida represented the last vestige of Spanish colonialism in North America. The weakness of Spanish control attracted a diverse group of settlers from the United States. Many were fleeing legal troubles or seeking opportunities denied to them in the more established colonies. Others were drawn by the promise of fertile land and the chance to build a new life on the frontier. These settlers, though united by their pursuit of opportunity, would soon find themselves caught in a web of conflict that would shape the destiny of Florida and its native inhabitants. The Seminoles, a Native American people with roots in various southeastern tribes, were drawn to Florida's relative isolation and the sanctuary it offered from encroaching European powers. They established settlements, cultivated the land, and forged a distinct identity shaped by their new environment and the influx of runaway slaves seeking refuge in their communities. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. The arrival of increasing numbers of American settlers, driven by a hunger for land and fueled by the expansionist ambitions of the young United States, set the stage for a clash of cultures and a struggle for control of Florida that would escalate into decades of conflict. The Seminole Wars, a series of bloody confrontations between the U.S. government and the Seminole people, would leave an indelible mark on Florida's history, shaping its identity and the fate of its native inhabitants for generations to come. Drawn by the allure of untamed wilderness and the promise of new beginnings, settlers from Georgia and South Carolina began to trickle into northern Florida in the late 18th century. These pioneers, hardened by life on the frontier and accustomed to the challenges of carving a living from the land, were a diverse group, ranging from escaped slaves and indentured servants seeking freedom to ambitious farmers and restless adventurers. They came to be known as Florida Crackers, a term whose origins remain debated but which came to embody their independent spirit and rugged way of life. These early settlers, often at odds with the distant Spanish authorities, established homesteads, cultivated crops, and established a foothold in this new land. They adapted to the subtropical climate, learned to navigate the dense swamps and forests, and coexisted sometimes peacefully, sometimes uneasily, with the Seminole people who called Florida home. The Crackers, however, were not simply peaceful pioneers. Many were fiercely independent, accustomed to living by their own rules and suspicious of any form of government control. Their ranks included outlaws, fugitives, and those seeking to escape the constraints of society. This independent streak, coupled with their growing resentment of Spanish rule and conflicts over land and resources with the Seminoles, created a volatile mix that would soon ignite into open rebellion. The Florida Crackers, though far from a monolithic group, shared a common bond, a deep connection to the land they had claimed as their own. They were, in many ways, the embodiment of the American frontier spirit, resourceful, resilient, and determined to carve out their own destiny, even if it meant challenging the established order. Their actions, though often driven by self-interest, would have far-reaching consequences, contributing to the collapse of Spanish rule and setting in motion the chain of events that would lead to Florida becoming part of the United States. The year 1810 witnessed a dramatic turn of events in West Florida, a region encompassing parts of modern-day Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Fueled by growing unrest among the American settlers and a desire to break free from Spanish rule, a group of rebels, led by figures like John Rhea and Fulwar Skipwith, seized control of the Spanish fort at Baton Rouge. This audacious act marked the beginning of the West Florida Rebellion, a brief but significant chapter in the region's turbulent history. The rebels, declaring the territory independent from Spain, established the free and independent Republic of West Florida. They adopted a constitution modeled after that of the United States, raised a flag bearing a single white star on a blue field, and sought recognition and support from the U.S. government. Their hope was to join the United States, seeing it as a natural ally in their quest for self-determination. The U.S. government, however, faced a delicate diplomatic situation. While sympathetic to the rebels' cause, President James Madison was wary of provoking a conflict with Spain, especially at a time when Europe was embroiled in Napoleonic Wars. The Republic of West Florida's existence proved short-lived. Just weeks after its declaration of independence, President Madison issued a proclamation annexing the territory into the United States. The rebels, lacking the military strength to resist, reluctantly acquiesced to American control. The dream of an independent West Florida faded into history. Section 4. The First Seminole War, a prelude to removal and resistance. The First Seminole War, which took place from 1817 to 1818, marked the beginning of a long and bloody conflict between the United States and the Seminole people. This struggle was deeply rooted in the expansionist ambitions of the young nation and the Seminoles' determination to resist the loss of their homeland. The war was sparked by a complex interplay of factors, including the increasing encroachment of American settlers onto Seminole lands, the presence of runaway slaves seeking refuge in Seminole communities, and the U.S. government's desire to assert control over Florida. In 1817, under the command of General Andrew Jackson, a future president known for his military exploits and his harsh treatment of Native Americans, U.S. forces invaded Spanish Florida. Jackson, operating with broad authority from President James Monroe, launched a series of swift and brutal campaigns against Seminole villages. He burned their homes, destroyed their crops, and drove them deeper into the Florida wilderness. The Seminoles, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought fiercely to defend their territory. They employed guerrilla tactics, using their knowledge of the Everglades and their skill at stealthy warfare to harass Jackson's forces. Despite their resistance, the Seminoles were unable to halt the American advance. Jackson's campaigns, though militarily successful, were marked by brutality and a disregard for civilian casualties. His actions, while condemned by some in the U.S. government, effectively solidified American control over East Florida and paved the way for the territory's formal cession to the United States a few years later. The First Seminole War, though often overshadowed by the larger conflicts that followed, stands as a grim foreshadowing of the violence and displacement that would come to characterize the relationship between the United States and the Seminole people. Section 5. Florida changes hands, the Adams-Onis Treaty, and its consequences. The year 1821 marked a turning point in the history of Florida and the southeastern United States. After years of diplomatic wrangling and escalating tensions, Spain, weakened by internal strife and facing mounting pressures elsewhere in its shrinking empire, agreed to cede Florida to the United States. This historic transfer of territory was formalized in the Adams-Onis Treaty, named for U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and Spanish Foreign Minister Luis de Onis. The treaty, signed in 1819 but ratified in 1821, had far-reaching consequences. For Spain, it represented a recognition of its declining power and influence in the New World. For the United States, it was a major victory, solidifying its control over the southeastern coastline and removing a persistent source of tension on its southern border. The acquisition of Florida, however, came at a cost. The treaty contained provisions requiring the United States to prevent future raids by Seminole warriors into U.S. territory. This obligation would prove difficult to fulfill and would entangle the United States in decades of conflict with the Seminoles, who were deeply resentful of the treaty that ceded their homeland without their consent. The Adams-Onis Treaty, though celebrated as a diplomatic triumph, set in motion a chain of events that would have tragic consequences for the Seminole people. It paved the way for increased American settlement in Florida, heightened tensions over land and resources, and ultimately, the forced removal of most Seminoles from their ancestral lands. Section 6. The Indian Removal Act, a Nation's Promise, a People's Displacement. The Indian Removal Act, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson in 1830, stands as one of the most controversial and consequential pieces of legislation in U.S. history. This act, fueled by a toxic mix of racism, greed for land, and a belief in the inherent superiority of white American culture, authorized the president to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi River, with the goal of relocating them to lands west of the Mississippi. The act, though framed as a voluntary exchange, was anything but. The tribes, facing the threat of military force and the relentless pressure of encroaching white settlement, were often coerced into signing treaties that stripped them of their ancestral lands and forced them to embark on perilous journeys to unfamiliar and often inhospitable territories. The Indian Removal Act had a devastating impact on the Native American tribes of the Southeast. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, known collectively as the 5 civilized tribes, were particularly affected. These tribes, despite having adopted many aspects of European culture and living peacefully alongside their white neighbors, were forcibly removed from their homelands, enduring hardship, disease, and death along the infamous Trail of Tears. The Seminoles, residing in Florida, resisted removal with a tenacity that distinguished them from other tribes. Their resistance, however, would come at a heavy price, leading to decades of bloody conflict and the decimation of their population.